Hi, I'm John Hamilton. We're here from Christ Church, and we're starting a new series that has to do with this season of Lent. And Lent is about getting ready. And so getting ready for what? Well, today is the time to get ready for tomorrow. Lent is a time to get ready for the resurrection. My wife Lisa likes to say, you can only bring to a crisis the person you already are. So if we want to be ready for our next crisis, which is coming, then we need to get ready. We need to find out who we are, learn our limits. We need to start getting ready for life. And so Lent is a season on the church calendar. You say, what is a church calendar? Well, we have a calendar year, which normally starts in January for everybody and runs through December. We have a school calendar, which starts normally in March in Uruguay or in August in the United States, where I'm from. We have the school year, the calendar year, the fiscal year. The fiscal year, how we organize our budget for organizations and companies. We have the tax year, which is when the government decides when our taxes are, what our taxes are and when they're due. And so we have all these different kinds of years. We also have a church year. The church year, the church calendar, begins with Advent. And that's 4 weeks before Christmas. So Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, then comes Lent, and then Easter and Pentecost. And then there are other dates and other things, but those are the main ones. And so Lent this season starts with Ash Wednesday, which was last Wednesday, and runs for 40 days plus Sundays until it concludes on Easter Sunday, the Sunday of Resurrection. And so 40 days, not counting Sundays, 40 days is a common number that's used since ancient times to mean 40 days, but also to mean a time of completeness, of fullness. So the idea of 40 days and 40 nights appears a number of times in the Bible. For example, the well-known story of the flood in Genesis. God sends rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Or the time when Moses climbed Mount Sinai to spend time with God. The story of how God gave the covenant to the people of Israel. And Moses went up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Or when Jesus, after his baptism, went out into the desert to fast and pray and be tempted by the devil, he went for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, the season of Lent is traditionally a time of preparing, focusing, and sacrificing in order to achieve God's purpose in your life and in the lives of those around you. Lent is never about the individual. Lent is really about the community, about the larger community who will be impacted by the work that God is doing, the transformation that God is bringing in your life. So Lent is also about accepting our limitations as we remember the limitations of Jesus. If we start reading the gospel, and we'll be looking at the gospel, the life of Jesus as he moves through the gospels during this series. But as we start reading the gospel, we find first his birth and his baptism and then his battle with temptation. And so those are three limitations I'd like to mention. His birth in the back patio of an overcrowded hostel, you might say. He humbled himself. He became obedient to death, wrote Paul. He submitted his life to the frail, flawed, fearful life of a small boy born into a family struggling to survive, moving as migrants, born into a life of hard work, hungry nights, tears, troubles, and trials. When we read about Jesus' baptism in the muddy, shallow Jordan River by his eccentric, nomadic cousin John, Jesus joined the multitudes who were going down to the river to cry out to God for justice. They went to confess their sins, to be baptized by John, but they're crying out for justice in a cruel and uncertain world. Jesus himself was filled with discernment, with authority, but he stayed low. Nobody seemed to know who he was. Just a carpenter's son from Nazareth. a nobody going nowhere. Jesus was putting in the work, walking in the shadows of the hills, passing through the small towns, studying the scriptures, praying in the desert. Jesus was a survivor. He was a man who slept under the stars. He caught fish for food, and he built animal pens and fences and furniture for his neighbors and families in his town. And he studied the scriptures. So his birth, his baptism, and his battle with temptation in a harsh desert climate far away from comforts and conversation. Jesus was familiar with the desert, but after his baptism, he went out there for 40 days and nights. Why? He wanted to test himself. He wanted to face the hard questions and find out if he was really ready. Jesus went into the desert alone to complete his season of preparation in order to live the life that God was opening before him. 3 of the Gospels summarize the temptations that Jesus faced in the desert, but we can read them as just easy, simple conversations with his adversary, who we call the devil. But let me tell you, over 40 days and nights, Jesus was pushed to the extreme limits of his physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual health. Jesus was pushed to the very edge. His adversary came along to test him wherever he thought he might find an advantage. His adversary tested him at the point of Jesus' fears, the fear of weakness, of suffering, of failure. "Turn these stones into bread," the devil told him. And the lie he was asking Jesus to believe, the lie was, if you don't take care of yourself, no one else will. God's not going to be there for you. The adversary tested him at the point of his pride. He said, "I can make you rich and powerful. I can give you everything you want, the big prize, without any effort." The lie he wanted Jesus to believe was, you can have it all when you want it and the way you want it, without any extra cost to you. His adversary tested him at the point of his purpose, his ambition in life. He told him, "You have the power. You are the God-man. Just call your angels. Just make it happen." The lie he wanted Jesus to believe was, "Jesus, you know the best way. You don't need God or anybody else placing limits on your life." Well, how do we know if we're ready? I'll come back to those temptations in a moment, but how do we know if we're ready? We can take a practice test to see if we know the answers. The Gospels tell us that Jesus already knew the answers by the time he was 12, celebrating his bar mitzvah in Jerusalem, surrounded by his families and friends. But besides a practice test, we can take the real life test, the reality test. And that's when we face the crises as they face us in life. And we bring to the crisis only the person we already are from the preparation we've already made. When Jesus went into the desert, he had already faced the limitations of his birth, his poverty, his minority status, his apparent loss of his father, the lack of emotional support from his family. Jesus had faced many limitations, but now he purposefully faced one more. He chose intentionally to go out into the desert, to fast, pray, and fight with the devil. As we say in Godly Play, he went to find out more about who he was and what his work was meant to be. The devil appears in the desert as an adversary. Maybe he came as a person, but maybe he just came as an idea inside Jesus' head, like an anxious fear or an obsessive impulse or a compelling addiction. When Jesus was tempted, the disciples later wrote, probably based on what Jesus had told them, he was tempted in all ways, just as we are. All of us face similar temptations. Maybe the details change, but the devil comes to everyone with powerfully compelling arguments and temptations. Jesus faced fear and anxiety. He was hungry and alone. He wasn't sure if he could trust God for his provision. Turn these stones into bread, came the tempting thought. I can figure this out on my own. I can't wait for God to provide the strength I need. I need to manage this on my own. Jesus was tempted, but he didn't give in. He resisted the temptation to not trust, to be anxious and afraid. Later he told James, his brother, who wrote it down for us, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Well, the devil came back again. He doesn't like to stay away long, and he came back this time tempting Jesus with a get-rich-quick scheme. He wanted him to gamble. He was saying, in essence, you don't have to live this silly life with all these pitiful people. You can ask me now, and I will give you anything. I will give you everything. The devil was offering things he didn't really have, but apparently the idea was tempting to Jesus. Things like gambling, drug and alcohol abuse, pornography, illicit sexual relationships outside of our marriage commitment, they're all variations on the same temptation. It's to believe an illusion, to see something we want to see or that other people want us to see and believe that it's reality. We know it's not reality. Maybe we're only seeing what we're hoping for. Chasing illusions is a sure way to have an empty and meaningless life. Jesus resisted this temptation to pursue power and pleasure as a priority for his life. Later, he told his friends, who wrote it down for us, I did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many. Well, the devil came back again, this time probably when Jesus was at his weakest, and he suggested that Jesus just simply give up. It's too hard. It's not really worth it, and God's going to work it all out anyways. Just throw yourself down, the devil said. The angels will catch you, and this really isn't your responsibility. Jesus was tempted to stop caring, to stop serving, to surrender to this culture of hopelessness, fatalism, and self-pity. Jesus was tempted to just quit trying to help other people, to stop trying to be the good, honest, faithful, caring person. But he resisted. And later, he told his best friend John, who wrote it down for us, I am the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have come that you may have life. I am the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep. No one takes my life away. I lay it down. Jesus returned from the desert with a renewed sense of purpose, integrity, and focus for his life. He was more certain than ever, more aware than ever of his mission in life. He was focused. He was alert. He was ready. So why are we talking about Lent? Well, Lent has been a tradition for more than 1,500 years as a time for preparation. Preparation as we learn to face our own limits, discovering more about who we are and what God's purposes for our life might be. But why? Well, limits are real. We all make mistakes. We all fall. We all fail. We will all die. When we recognize our limits, we can live more honestly and freely. We can face our fears, admit our weaknesses, confess our failures. Community begins with people who accept their limitations. You know, other people connect with your stories of your failures and your struggles, but they don't connect with the stories of your success. I've been reading a great little book by a fellow named Trey Campbell called 12 Jars. And in it he gives many quotes, wise, profound quotes from his grandfather. And one that I just read says, you can't have a forest without fallen trees. If you want significant personal connection with others, you need to understand limits. How? learn your limits by setting limits. Set a limit to your physical diet, your social media diet, your Netflix diet, your noise, your activity. Set a limit that you can feel. Jesus practiced living within limits for many years before he went to the extreme step of going out into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights to be tempted by the devil. If you haven't practiced, then I suggest you start small. Start with a limit that you can succeed at, but that's still big enough to be a challenge. The desert is hard. The desert is not a fun or a friendly place, but it can be an unforgettably beautiful experience for those who spend time there. Last Wednesday was called Ash Wednesday. Many Christians, most Christian traditions practice some form of prayer and ashes on Ash Wednesday. Other traditions do not. I normally do not, but next year I might. I've been thinking about it, wondering and studying and reflecting. My friend, pastor and author Rich Villodas recently published an article on Ash Wednesday where he wrote, "The ashes represent our weakness, humanity, and the fragility of life. We are human and not God. Therefore, we are given an opportunity to recognize our limitations and choose to not live with the guilt of being human." Ash Wednesday, or Lent, is not a day or a time to live in guilt. It's a time to recognize our brokenness, our humanity, limits, and trust in God's love. It's a time to freely come before God and say, "I am human, I am dust, and you still love me." Well, if you know about Lent or not, we are in the season. 40 days plus Sundays will bring us right to Resurrection Sunday, Easter morning, when we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. There's nothing more important in all of human history than the reality of the resurrection. Paul wrote, announcing to the whole world, "If Jesus is not risen, then our faith is in vain, and we are of all people to be most pitied, believing and building our lives on a false hope. But he is risen. He is alive. He has conquered death, hell, and the devil himself." Life with its limitations must be lived. Death will be our final enemy, and we must prepare ourselves. But we are also preparing for victory. We are getting used to overcoming obstacles, overcoming temptations, overcoming anxiety and fears and illusions. We are becoming overcomers. And Jesus promised his close friend John, who wrote it down for us, "To the person who overcomes, I will give a crown of life." Lent is preparing your heart, soul, body, mind, and strength to overcome any obstacle that will keep you from growing into a wonderfully unique friend whose life matters to many. A Christian is to be a little Christ, a person who lives well and loves well, honoring God, serving others, and bringing faith, hope, and love into our world. May God bless you. Have a great week.